For more on 30 years of freedom, we're joined by activist and author Zulaikha Patel. Zulaikha, thank you so much for joining us this evening on News at Prime, and happy Freedom Day to you. I guess as a young activist in South Africa, how would you categorize your experience of democracy? How free do you really feel?
A very good evening to you too. Thank you very much for having me. I wouldn't exactly say that this is a happy Freedom Day, given that we live in a South Africa that still has the remnants of the previously legislated apartheid regime present and tangible in our society, in many facets of our society, from how we live. We still live in the construct of apartheid. We still have a lack of resources and a lack of opportunities in townships and rural communities in the country. We still live in an economic divide, and we still live through the constructs of apartheid. What was previously legislated isn't constitutionalized anymore. However, it's been institutionalized. And I mention institutionalized racism because if I had to talk about my personal experience, having been a young person born post-94 into South Africa, where we are constitutionally free and politically free, as I would say it, and looking at how I've lived my life through going to school, and the experiences that I had to date made me realize that we live in a South Africa which is not free of any racial prejudice as yet. We are not entirely free of racial prejudice and racial oppression. My personal experience gave me the harsh awakening that South Africa is still a country that is deeply still attached to the system of racism, the system of racial oppression. And I got to see that through my experiences of having gone to school, and my experience in high school as well, and my experience of having been born into an interfaith and an interracial family. I saw the reality that racism was not buried in 1994 when former President Nelson Mandela was inaugurated. However, it then became institutionalized, and we've got a long way to go as a country. We need to take this moment now, 30 years into democracy, and now, especially today, that we actually are at that 30 years anniversary today. We need to take this almost as a tool that's meant to pivot us in a direction where we continue to do the work to make South Africa a truly anti-racist society. And it's so important that we continue the work on making South Africa a truly anti-racist society, because many of the social injustices that the majority of our country are faced with are connected to race and are connected to racism. In South Africa to date, we still live in a country whereby your entire life's outcome, how you live overall throughout your life, your access to healthcare, your access to the education, your access to opportunity, where you live, how long you live as well, is all determined by your race. We still live in a country where your race determines your entire life's outcome. And that is what we need to fight against. That's why I say we have so much work to do on our country. We shouldn't be celebrating, but rather we should take this moment as an important step towards pivoting in the right direction to continue to do the work on this country in transforming it. And the work of transforming this country is going to be done through decolonization, because here we are 30 years later. We had our constitution change, and now we have a constitution that's rooted in the values of equality, Ubuntu, and freedom. And that constitution served almost as a mediating instrument to transition us from what was then the legislated apartheid regime into the now democratic dispensation. And now what we need to do post 30 years is move in a direction of decolonization and decolonizing our society fully, decolonizing our institutions. So there's so much work that still needs to be done. And all that work that needs to be done on this country, the project of transforming this country, must be led by young people. So when we move and pivot in a direction of continuing to do the work and taking this moment as an important step in accounting for what the wrongs were in the past 30 years, because there were many wrongs which need to be accounted for, and moving forward on what needs to be done. That specific project has to be led by young people.
Your experience, you also speak about your school experience as well. That's very well documented. You fought the good fight at Pretoria Girls High School. Would you say, Zulaikha, that was perhaps the tip of the iceberg, and what you have experienced post that? I mean, at the time you were only 13 years old. What you experienced post that was even the bigger picture that you're painting about race relations in this country and the problems of it?
It was the tip of the iceberg. It's essentially the straw that broke the camel's back, and not just for me personally. That particular moment is bigger than me, and it's also gone beyond me. It's much bigger than me, and it cannot be centered just around me. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Prior to then, we had never had the hard and tough conversation that, as much as there is a large number of schools that were historically segregated and historically set aside for white children only, on the basis of, under the apartheid regime, when the Bantu Education Act was legislated, it was a turning point in after 94, or prior to 94, in the early 90s, a lot of these schools were desegregated and the gates were opened up to all races. However, these institutions were built on the basis of exclusion. They were built in the light that one day an Indian, a black child, or a colored child won't form part of its environment. So it was built on exclusion. Its tradition is built on exclusion. Its tradition is centered around whiteness and centering and positioning whiteness at the center, right? And positioning whiteness at the center as something much more superior than everyone else, and creating a culture whereby once you form part of the institution, you must forcefully assimilate to whiteness. And so there was never, ever a moment where we critically stopped to analyze that these schools also have so much work that needs to be done on them. It's not enough that the laws have changed around education and anyone can attend any school they wish to attend and not be hindered on the basis of race. However, it's not enough that laws change, and it's not enough that they were merely desegregated, because you need to change and decolonize those institutions and completely change the cultures and traditions that uphold the institutions. It's not enough that the gates were opened up to all races. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back, in saying that there's so much work that needs to be done on these institutions beyond policies. Just decolonizing the traditions and cultures that uphold the institutions is a very important factor as well.
You speak about this fight also needing young people as well. When we take a look at our current leadership as well, there's a lack thereof of young people. The experience that you had in high school is an experience that someone from my generation can also relate to, that somebody currently in school can also still relate to. What do you think it says about our current state, that we haven't been able to address those issues and dismantle that kind of institutional racism, where previously Model C or white-only schools are now just opening their doors, but not opening the culture of the school as well?
It says to me that we are a country that isn't fully liberated. We may be politically liberated, where we mustn't take for granted that we're politically liberated and everyone has the right to vote, one man, one vote, and it is a right that is protected. That is protected, and it's a right that everyone in the country, in any corner of the country, can express, right? We mustn't take that for granted, because it took a lot to achieve political freedom, to be able to vote and have that agency to make your voice heard in shaping the country. However, what we must also realize, and we must be very critical of, is that political freedom merely on its own is not enough. And we've gotten to this point where we've had the previous generation and the current generation that is actually the dominant generation in leadership where there's an absence of young people, there's an absence of millennials, there's an absence of Gen Z, and it's predominantly made up of the age group of early 60s, late 70s, late 50s, right? And this is the same generation that brought us out of the clutches of apartheid and brought us to having political freedom. So that generation has achieved the mission it was responsible for achieving. So we've now gotten to a point whereby we have to be unapologetic and we have to be direct and unapologetic about the fact that there needs to be more young people in governance and in decision making, because in order to transform the country currently and pivot the country in a direction of decolonization and pivot the country in a direction of achieving what's left to achieve, economic liberation, and fully, truly liberating our society from any remnants of colonialism and apartheid that still remain, has to be led and done by young people. It's young people who form the majority of the demographic of our country. It's young people that are the majority in our country, and it's young people that must be represented in positions of leadership and in governance. Young people who are on the ground and form the majority of our population's demographic must be able to see themselves reflected in governance and in leadership. And the only way our country is also going to change is if young people are at the forefront of transforming our country. We're here now 30 years. What will the next 30 years look like? We can't then sit 60 years later and still be having the race question on our table and still live in a country where the remnants of apartheid still exist amongst us. We must look 60 years later and see our country truly transformed, and truly transformed in terms of your life's outcome shouldn't be determined by your race and determined by where you live and which end of the stick you're on. That shouldn't be the reality 60 years later. And so we need to see more young people in leadership, because also there's been so many wrongs that have been done in the past 30 years by leaders in government who need to also account for those wrongs and be held accountable. And also, it must be a critical moment for us to also say that perhaps the generation that leads us and is in governance is not in touch with what's on the ground and is out of touch with the issues. And perhaps they were in touch back then when they were young and when they were at the forefront of liberating this country from the clutches of apartheid, but aren't in touch anymore. And so perhaps it's time for that generation to step down and to allow young people to lead.